In 1885, deep in the mist-shrouded Great Smoky Mountains, the wealthy Pemberton sisters made a decision that would shock even the most isolated mountain folk. Eleonora and Cassandra, heirs to a decaying tobacco fortune, had been raised by their father Josiah to believe their bloodline was divinely pure. After his death, they became guardians of the twisted Pemberton Covenant, a doctrine forbidding marriage outside the family. Between 1895 and 1908, both sisters bore children to their own father and brothers, infants born with fatal deformities who were quietly buried behind their estate. When family members challenged this sacred duty, horrifying murders began. Sheriff Brody Willard would discover the mansion held unimaginable secrets. How did divine justification mask such depravity? What drove them to kill their own brothers? How did this reign of terror hide for 30 years? Subscribe to stand with us as we uncover the stories history buried, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and your local time. The Great Smoky Mountains in 1885 stretched like an endless green ocean across the border of North Carolina and Tennessee, their peaks shrouded in perpetual mist that seemed to swallow entire valleys whole. These were not the accessible wilderness areas that tourists would later discover, but a labyrinth of forgotten hollows and ridges where families could vanish from the world's attention for generations. In one such valley, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that wound 15 miles from the nearest settlement, stood the Pemberton Mansion, a monument to wealth built on the broken backs of enslaved labor and sustained by the endless appetite of northern tobacco mills. The mansion itself defied the rustic poverty that characterized most Appalachian homesteads. Rising 3 stories from a foundation of native stone, its white columns and wraparound porches spoke to an era when the Pemberton name commanded respect across 3 counties. Josiah Pemberton had inherited not just land, but an entire system of human bondage that had made his family wealthy beyond the dreams of their mountain neighbors. Even after the Civil War ended legal slavery, the Pembertons had maintained their workforce through a web of debt and isolation that proved nearly as effective as chains. The dozen or so families who remained on the estate found themselves bound to the land by debts that somehow never diminished, no matter how many seasons they worked the tobacco fields or how much timber they hauled down the mountain. To the few hundred souls who comprised the nearest settlement of Millbrook Crossing, the Pembertons represented both aspiration and mystery. Local merchants spoke in hushed tones of the substantial orders that arrived quarterly, fine fabrics from Charleston, medical supplies from Knoxville, and books that came wrapped in brown paper from universities as far away as Philadelphia. The family's rare appearances in town created a stir that lasted for weeks. Josiah Pemberton, tall and commanding with premature gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, would arrive in a well-maintained carriage accompanied by his daughters. Eleonora and Cassandra, even as children, possessed an otherworldly composure that made the local women whisper about breeding and bloodlines in tones usually reserved for discussing prized livestock. What struck the townspeople most was the family's profound insularity. While other wealthy families in the region maintained connections to distant relatives or sent their children to boarding schools, the Pembertons seemed to exist in complete isolation. No cousins visited for holidays, no marriage proposals were entertained, and no young men were ever seen calling on the daughters despite their obvious beauty and substantial inheritance. Josiah had built a world within a world, where his children grew to adulthood knowing only the confines of the estate and the gospel, according to their father's increasingly eccentric philosophies. The first whispers of strangeness began in the 1890s, though at the time they seemed like nothing more than mountain gossip amplified by isolation and boredom. Local workers who had been hired for seasonal labor on the Pemberton estate began sharing odd observations. They spoke of medical supplies delivered in quantities that seemed excessive for a family of 5, chloroform, laudanum, surgical instruments, and obstetrical equipment that would not have been out of place in a hospital. More puzzling was the complete absence of children on the estate, despite persistent rumors that both daughters had been seen in the family way on multiple occasions throughout the previous decade. Workers also noted the strange rhythm of life at the mansion. Periods of complete silence would be broken by nights of frantic activity, oil lamps burning in the cellar until dawn, the sound of digging from the family cemetery, and the acrid smell of burning fabric and other materials that drifted down the mountain on certain mornings. Most unsettling of all were the screams that occasionally echoed through the valley in the dead of night, sounds that the family dismissed as wildcats or the settling of old timbers, explanations that satisfied no one who had actually heard them. By the turn of the century, a pattern of tragedy had begun to emerge around the Pemberton family, though each individual incident seemed plausible enough when viewed in isolation. Samuel Pemberton, the youngest son, had reportedly left the valley in 1906 after a violent disagreement with his father, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and leaving no forwarding address. Benjamin Pemberton, the elder son, had died in what was officially recorded as a hunting accident in 1909, though several workers privately noted that Benjamin had been seen arguing with his sisters the morning of his death about his plans to marry a woman from Millbrook Crossing. These losses, tragic as they seemed, were not uncommon in a region where young men frequently sought their fortunes elsewhere or fell victim to the dangers of mountain life. What made the Pemberton tragedies different was the family's reaction to them. Where mountain families typically grieved openly and leaned on their communities for support, the Pembertons responded to each loss with an eerie tranquility that bordered on indifference. Eleanora and Cassandra, now in their 30s and the sole surviving heirs to the family fortune, seemed to grow more serene with each death, as if some great burden had been lifted rather than imposed. Their rare appearances in town became even more infrequent, and when they did venture beyond their valley, they carried themselves with the quiet satisfaction of women who had successfully completed some sacred duty that others could never understand. Sheriff Brodie Willard first encountered the Pemberton sisters in the spring of 1910, though at the time he had no reason to suspect them of anything more serious than the eccentricity that seemed to afflict many of the region's isolated wealthy families. Willard was 57 years old, a methodical man who had spent nearly 3 decades navigating the complex social hierarchies and unwritten codes that governed law enforcement in the mountains. Unlike the federal marshals who occasionally rode through the county chasing moonshiners or draft dodgers, Willard understood that effective policing in Appalachia required patience, discretion, and an almost anthropological understanding of the communities he served. The sheriff's involvement with the Pembertons began not with a crime report, but with a legal dispute that should have been routine. A distant cousin of the family residing in Knoxville had hired an attorney to challenge certain aspects of the Pemberton land holdings, claiming that portions of the estate rightfully belonged to his branch of the family tree. The matter required official notification of the legal proceedings, and as county sheriff, Willard was tasked with delivering the papers personally to the estate. What should have been a simple administrative duty would instead become the first thread in unraveling one of the most horrific family secrets in American criminal history. The journey to the Pemberton estate was an ordeal that reinforced just how effectively the family had isolated themselves from outside scrutiny. Willard's horse picked its way carefully along a trail that hadn't been properly maintained in years, winding through dense forest where the canopy blocked so much sunlight that it felt like perpetual twilight. The path crossed 3 separate creek beds, each requiring careful navigation, and climbed steadily into terrain so remote that Willard began to understand how entire families could simply vanish from the world's consciousness without anyone thinking to look for them. When the mansion finally came into view, Willard was struck by both its grandeur and its decay. The white columns still commanded respect, but closer inspection revealed peeling paint, sagging gutters, and windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. The grounds, once meticulously maintained, showed signs of neglect that suggested the family either lacked the resources or the inclination to maintain their ancestral home. More unsettling was the absolute silence that surrounded the property. No sounds of livestock, no voices of workers, no signs of the bustling activity that typically characterized even modest mountain homesteads. Eleanora Pemberton answered the door herself, a breach of protocol that immediately struck Willard as significant. Wealthy families, even in decline, typically employed servants to handle interactions with outsiders. She was a handsome woman in her late 30s, with prematurely gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to assess and dismiss him in a single glance. Her manner was cordial but distant, as if she were receiving a tradesman rather than a county official. Cassandra appeared moments later, a quieter version of her sister who remained in the background throughout the conversation, speaking only when directly addressed and then in monosyllables that revealed nothing of her thoughts. The sisters received the legal papers with a composure that bordered on indifference. Eleanora read through the documents carefully, while Cassandra watched from the shadows of the foyer, and neither woman showed any surprise or concern about the challenge to their property rights. When Willard attempted to engage them in conversation about the practical implications of the lawsuit, Eleanora responded with prepared answers that felt rehearsed, speaking of their deceased brother's affairs with the same detached precision she might have used to discuss the weather. What disturbed Willard most was not what the sisters said, but what they didn't say. When he mentioned Samuel and Benjamin by name, neither woman showed the natural emotional response he expected from family members discussing recently deceased relatives. There was no softening of expression, no momentary grief, no fond memories shared. Instead, both sisters regarded him with the same cool assessment, as if his questions about their brothers were somehow improper or irrelevant. Willard left the Pemberton estate that day with his official duty completed, but his instincts deeply troubled. Something fundamental was wrong with the picture the sisters had painted of their family's recent tragedies, though he couldn't articulate exactly what bothered him. The ride back to town gave him hours to reflect on the encounter, and by the time he reached his office, he had made a decision that would consume the next 2 years of his life. He was going to quietly investigate the Pemberton family, not because he had evidence of a crime, but because 30 years of law enforcement had taught him to trust the feeling in his gut that told him when people were lying about something important. The investigation that followed was a master class in patient, methodical police work, conducted under the constraints of limited resources and primitive communication. Willard began by pulling every official record he could find related to the Pemberton family, tax assessments, land deeds, census reports, and death certificates. What emerged from this paper trail was a family tree that seemed to wither and die with each generation. The 1900 census listed 5 family members living at the estate, but by 1910, only the 2 sisters remained. Samuel Pemberton's supposed departure in 1906 had never been officially recorded, and no forwarding address existed in any government file. Benjamin's death certificate, signed by the family physician, listed the cause of death as accidental gunshot wound, but the doctor who had signed it had himself died 2 years later, taking any first-hand knowledge of the circumstances with him to the grave. More disturbing were the patterns that emerged from deeper research. Willard discovered that the Pemberton family had employed a succession of physicians over the years, never maintaining a relationship with any single doctor for more than a few years at a time. Each physician's service seemed to end abruptly, often coinciding with the doctor's decision to relocate to another county or state. Similarly, the family's legal affairs had been handled by at least 4 different attorneys since 1890, each apparently dismissed after handling only routine matters like property taxes or business correspondence. The sheriff's most challenging task was interviewing former workers from the Pemberton estate. These were people who lived on the margins of mountain society, former slaves and their descendants, poor white families trapped in cycles of debt peonage, and seasonal laborers who moved from farm to farm seeking work. Many were illiterate, most distrusted authority figures, and all had been conditioned by generations of poverty to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Willard spent months building relationships with these potential witnesses, often traveling to remote cabins and sharecropper shacks scattered across 3 counties. The stories he eventually gathered painted a picture of life at the Pemberton estate that was both mundane and deeply unsettling. Workers spoke of being hired for specific tasks, clearing land, repairing buildings, harvesting tobacco, but never being allowed to work anywhere near the main house after dark. They described a rigid hierarchy where the sisters maintained absolute control over every aspect of daily life, issuing orders through a handful of trusted intermediaries who had worked for the family for decades. Most troubling were the references to sounds and activities that workers were explicitly forbidden to investigate or discuss. Multiple former employees described hearing infants crying from within the mansion, sounds that would continue for days or weeks before suddenly stopping forever. Others spoke of being ordered to dig graves in the family cemetery for burials that took place at night, with no workers allowed to witness the actual interments. Several mentioned seeing the sisters burning large quantities of clothing and linens in the estate's furnace, fires that burned so hot they could be seen from miles away, and that filled the valley with smoke for days at a time. Despite these disturbing accounts, Willard's investigation had stalled by the winter of 1911. The former worker's testimony, while compelling, was largely hearsay and would never hold up in court. The official records, while suggestive, proved nothing beyond the family's tendency towards secrecy. The sheriff found himself in the frustrating position of being morally certain that serious crimes had been committed while being legally unable to prove that any crime had occurred at all. He had reached the limits of what conventional police work could accomplish in an era before forensic science, electronic communication, or centralized criminal databases. The breakthrough that would finally crack the case came from an unexpected source and in a manner that perfectly illustrated how justice in the mountains often depended more on community conscience than official investigation. In the early spring of 1912, Willard received an urgent message requesting his presence at the bedside of an elderly woman named Elspeth Keene. She was the daughter of Margaret Keene, who had served as the only midwife the Pemberton family had ever trusted with their most intimate secrets. Now dying of consumption in a one-room cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook Crossing, Elspeth had summoned the sheriff to unburden herself of knowledge that had tormented her for nearly 2 decades. Elspeth Keene was 68 years old, her body ravaged by the lung disease that had claimed so many mountain folk who lived in poorly ventilated cabins heated by wood smoke. She had never married, spending her life caring for her mother and eking out a living as a seamstress and herbalist. Her decision to break decades of silence was motivated not by civic duty, but by the profound religious conviction that she could not face her Maker while harboring such terrible secrets. When Willard arrived at her bedside on a cold March morning, she was lucid despite her physical frailty, and her first words to him were a warning that what she was about to reveal would haunt him for the rest of his life. The story Elspeth told, passed down from her mother's deathbed confession 15 years earlier, painted a picture of the Pemberton family that was far more horrific than even Willard's darkest suspicions. Margaret Keene had been summoned to the estate on multiple occasions between 1895 and 1908, always in the dead of night and always under circumstances of absolute secrecy. She had been paid extraordinary sums to deliver babies that were born with deformities so severe that they rarely survived more than a few days. The midwife had described these infants in terms that haunted her daughter's memory. Children with malformed skulls, twisted limbs, and internal organs that seemed to have developed incorrectly from the very beginning of gestation. What made these births even more disturbing was the clinical detachment with which the Pemberton sisters had regarded their own offspring. Margaret Keene had told her daughter that neither Eleonora nor Cassandra showed any maternal affection toward the babies, treating them instead as specimens in some sort of grotesque experiment. The sisters would examine each newborn carefully, making notes in a leather-bound journal, and discussing the children's deformities with the same dispassionate interest a scientist might show when documenting the results of a laboratory procedure. The midwife's most damning testimony concerned the identity of these children's fathers. According to Margaret Keene's account, the sisters had freely admitted that the babies were the product of unions with their own father and brothers, relationships they justified through elaborate theological arguments about maintaining the purity of their bloodline. Josiah Pemberton had apparently convinced his daughters that marriage outside the family was not merely socially undesirable, but a form of spiritual contamination that would doom their souls to eternal damnation. Elspeth's revelation about Samuel Pemberton's fate provided the crucial missing piece of Willard's investigation. Her mother had witnessed a violent confrontation between Samuel and his family in the summer of 1906, when the young man had announced his intention to leave the estate and marry a woman from a neighboring county. The argument had taken place in the mansion's main parlor, with Samuel shouting that he could no longer participate in what he called the family's abominations, and his sisters responding with cold fury about his betrayal of their sacred covenant. Margaret Keene had been present in the house that night, having been summoned to tend to Cassandra, who was recovering from a recent childbirth. From her position in an upstairs bedroom, she had heard Samuel's voice growing increasingly desperate as he argued with his sisters, followed by the sounds of a struggle and then an ominous silence. Later that night she had seen Eleonora and Cassandra dragging something heavy toward the root cellar, and the next morning Samuel was gone, supposedly having left the estate in anger after the family dispute. The midwife's most specific allegation concerned the location of Samuel's remains. She had told her daughter that she had seen the sisters emerging from the root cellar covered in dirt and lime, and that she had noticed fresh mortar around what appeared to be a newly bricked section of the cellar wall. This detail, more than any other, gave Willard the concrete lead he needed to finally take action against the Pemberton sisters. Elspeth Keene died peacefully 3 days after giving her statement to Sheriff Willard, her conscience finally clear after decades of carrying her mother's terrible secrets. Her testimony, combined with the circumstantial evidence Willard had gathered over 2 years of investigation, provided the probable cause necessary to obtain a search warrant for the Pemberton estate. On a gray morning in late March 1912, Willard assembled a small posse of trusted deputies and began the treacherous journey into the mountains, knowing that what they discovered would either vindicate his suspicions or destroy his reputation as a competent lawman. The search of the Pemberton estate began with an eerie sense of theatrical formality that would haunt the participants for the rest of their lives. Willard and his 3 deputies arrived at the mansion to find Eleonora and Cassandra Pemberton waiting for them on the front porch, dressed in their finest black clothing as if prepared for a funeral rather than a criminal investigation. The sisters received the search warrant with the same unsettling composure they had shown during Willard's previous visit, examining the legal document with academic interest before stepping aside to allow the lawman entry into their ancestral home. What struck the search party immediately was the mansion's oppressive atmosphere of order and cleanliness. Every surface had been meticulously maintained, every piece of furniture positioned with mathematical precision, and every room arranged as if for inspection by visiting dignitaries. The house felt more like a museum than a family home, with none of the comfortable disorder that characterized even the most well-kept residences. More unsettling was the complete absence of personal photographs, family portraits, or any visual record of the Pemberton lineage that had supposedly been so precious to the family's identity. The initial search of the mansion's main floors revealed nothing incriminating, though several details reinforced Willard's conviction that he was dealing with deeply disturbed individuals. The sisters' bedrooms were Spartan to the point of monasticism, containing only the barest necessities and showing no evidence of normal feminine interests or activities. More puzzling was the discovery of a library containing hundreds of books on subjects ranging from ancient religious texts to contemporary works on eugenics and racial theory, many heavily annotated in what appeared to be Josiah Pemberton's distinctive handwriting. The investigation's focus shifted to the root cellar when Willard's examination revealed discrepancies in the underground storage area that matched Elspeth Keene's description perfectly. The cellar, accessed through a heavy wooden door behind the mansion's kitchen, extended much further underground than the building's foundation would suggest. More significantly, one section of the stone wall showed clear evidence of recent masonry work with mortar that was noticeably different in color and composition from the original construction. The decision to break through the newer section of wall was made despite the sisters' calm protests that the sealed area contained nothing more than spoiled food supplies that had been walled off to prevent contamination of the remaining storage space. When Willard's sledgehammer finally broke through the mortar, the smell that emerged from the hidden chamber immediately confirmed their worst fears. Behind the wall lay a small, cramped space that had clearly been used as some sort of prison cell, complete with iron shackles still attached to the stone walls. The skeletal remains of Samuel Pemberton were found chained in a sitting position against the far wall of this makeshift dungeon, his bones showing clear evidence of violence, including a fractured skull that suggested he had been beaten to death rather than simply left to starve. More horrifying was the discovery of primitive surgical instruments scattered around the chamber, tools that appeared to have been used for some sort of crude medical experimentation. The condition of the remains suggested that Samuel had not died quickly, and the arrangement of medical equipment implied that his sisters had used his captivity to conduct procedures that served no conceivable therapeutic purpose. The search of the family cemetery proved equally damning, though the emotional impact of these discoveries was even more devastating than the evidence of Samuel's murder. Following Margaret Keene's descriptions, Willard's team located 4 small unmarked graves in an overgrown section behind the main burial plots. The exhumation of these sites revealed the tiny skeletons of infants whose bone development confirmed the midwife's accounts of severe congenital deformities. Each child showed evidence of conditions consistent with the genetic consequences of multiple generations of inbreeding, malformations so severe that survival beyond infancy would have been impossible. The final and most incriminating piece of evidence was discovered in Josiah Pemberton's former study, hidden behind a false panel in an antique desk. The leather-bound family ledger that Eleonora had maintained since her father's death provided a meticulous record of the family's crimes, written in precise handwriting that showed no recognition of moral wrongdoing. The journal documented each incestuous union with clinical detachment, recorded the births and deaths of the malformed infants with scientific precision, and detailed the theological justifications for Samuel and Benjamin's murders with the certainty of religious conviction. When Willard finally placed Eleanora and Cassandra Pemberton under arrest on that March afternoon in 1912, both sisters maintained the same supernatural calm they had displayed throughout the search. As they were led away from the mansion that had sheltered generations of their family's secrets, Eleanora's only comment was a quiet observation that their father would be proud of their loyalty to his teachings. The age of the Pemberton dynasty in the Great Smoky Mountains had finally come to an end, but the legal reckoning for their crimes was only beginning.